long before the name Hitler became synonymous with destruction. Before the swastika was carved into the memory of the 20th century, Germany was already drifting towards something darker. Not through tanks or speeches, but through ideas whispered in closed rooms, written in obscure pamphlets, and passed from hand to hand by men who believed history itself had chosen them. In 1918, Germany collapsed. The armistice of November 11th ended the First World War, but it did not bring peace. It brought humiliation. The Kaiser abdicated. The empire dissolved. Millions of soldiers returned home not as heroes, but as broken men, amputees, widowers, ghosts walking through cities that no longer felt like home. The Treaty of Versailles followed in 1919. Germany was blamed. Germany was punished. Germany was stripped of territory, military power, and dignity. Reparations crushed the economy. Inflation devoured savings. By 1923, a loaf of bread could cost billions of marks. For many Germans, this was not just defeat. It was betrayal. Rumors spread quickly. Germany had not been beaten on the battlefield. Germany had been stabbed in the back. This belief, later called the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back myth, did not arise in a vacuum. It fed on fear, anger, and a desperate hunger for meaning. When reality became unbearable, myth rushed in to replace it. And it was in this psychological vacuum that the roots of Nazism began to grow. Not in parliament, not yet in beer halls, but in secret societies, where fantasy was treated as history and hatred as revelation. One of those societies would call itself Thule Society. Post-war Germany was a nation suspended between worlds. The old order was gone. The new republic, the Weimar Republic, felt weak, artificial, imposed by foreign powers and guarded by politicians who spoke the language of compromise instead of strength. Meanwhile, revolution loomed. In January 1919, communist uprisings erupted in Berlin and Munich. The specter of Bolshevism haunted conservative elites. Russia had fallen. Could Germany be next? For many Germans, liberal democracy felt alien. Marxism felt apocalyptic. And Christianity, long tied to obedience and humility, felt powerless to explain why a chosen nation had fallen so low. So people searched elsewhere. They searched in race, blood, and ancient myths. They searched for a past that promised greatness and a future that demanded revenge. Occult and nationalist groups multiplied rapidly in this environment. Astrology circles, racial theorists, Volkisch clubs, mystical orders, all blending folklore, pseudoscience, and political extremism into a potent ideological brew. Among them, one group stood out, not because it was the largest, but because it connected myth to power. The Thule Society emerged in Munich in late 1918, officially founded as a cover organization for the German and Norden, an earlier secret nationalist order. Its public face was that of a cultural study group dedicated to researching Germanic antiquity. Its private reality was far more radical. The name Thule itself was not chosen at random. In classical mythology, Thule referred to a lost northern land, mentioned by ancient Greek and Roman writers as the edge of the known world. By the late 19th century, German racial theorists had transformed Thule into something else entirely. The mythical homeland of the Aryans, a vanished civilization of pure, godlike ancestors. According to this worldview, modern Germans were not merely citizens of a defeated nation. They were descendants of a fallen master race. And if they had fallen, it was not by accident. Someone had pushed them. Thule ideology fused extreme nationalism with obsessive anti-Semitism. Jews were not portrayed as a religious or cultural group, but as a cosmic threat, an opposing force in a racial war that spanned centuries. This was not political critique. It was metaphysical hatred. Jewish people were described in Thule writings as parasites weakening the racial body, manipulators behind capitalism and communism, enemies of nature, blood, and destiny itself. In this worldview, Germany's defeat in 1918 was not the result of strategic failure or industrial disadvantage. It was the outcome of racial sabotage. This belief was comforting. It removed guilt. It redirected rage. And most dangerously, it justified violence. The Thule Society was not a mass movement. It did not need to be. Its strength lay in initiation. Meetings were held in private apartments, hotel rooms, and back halls in Munich. Members swore oaths. Symbols were displayed. Ancient runes and sunwheels adorned documents and flags. These rituals served a purpose far deeper than superstition. They created belonging. To be part of Thule was to believe you had awakened to a truth hidden from the masses. You were not just German. You were chosen. You were a guardian of a forgotten legacy. This sense of secret knowledge forged loyalty more effectively than any political platform. And it attracted men who would later play key roles in Germany's descent into extremism: journalists, officers, financiers, propagandists. Not mystics on the margins, but future architects of power. Munich was not randomly chosen. In 1918 to 1919, the city was a pressure cooker of radical ideologies. After the war, Bavaria briefly became a socialist republic. Right-wing militias and left-wing revolutionaries fought openly in the streets. Political assassinations became common. For nationalist extremists, Munich represented both danger and opportunity. The Thule Society positioned itself as a counter-revolutionary force, funding paramilitary groups and supporting violent actions against perceived enemies. One of its members, Countess Hella von Westarp, described the group bluntly. "We were fighting Bolshevism with every means available. Those means included propaganda, money, and murder." In April 1919, after the suppression of the Bavarian Soviet Republic, Thule members were directly implicated in violent reprisals. Several were arrested. Some were executed by revolutionary forces before the counter-coup succeeded. Instead of destroying the society, this violence radicalized it further. Martyrdom strengthened the myth. The Thule Society did not seek power directly. What it did instead was more effective. It prepared the soil. Members supported nationalist newspapers. They financed political speakers. They provided meeting spaces for radical groups that echoed their ideology, groups that preached racial purity, national rebirth, and the necessity of strong leadership. One of those groups was a small, obscure party, founded in January 1919, the German Workers' Party. It would later become the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Nazis did not emerge from nowhere. They grew from a cultural ecosystem in which myth had already replaced reality, and violence was already framed as destiny. It is tempting to imagine history beginning with loud moments, coups, elections, invasions. But the most dangerous moments are often quiet. They occur when defeated societies stop asking what went wrong and start asking who must be punished. When myth becomes easier than truth. When identity replaces empathy. The Thule Society was not large. It was not omnipotent. It did not control Germany. But it offered something intoxicating in a time of despair. A story where suffering meant chosenness. A story where failure meant betrayal. A story where violence became sacred. And once such a story exists, it does not need to rule. It only needs to wait. Evil does not begin with orders. It begins with explanations that feel comforting and end with blood. The end of the war did not bring silence to Germany. It brought noise. Not the celebratory noise of victory, but the constant, grinding sound of a society tearing itself apart. In 1919, the streets of Munich were filled with shouting crowds, armed patrols, political posters, and rumors that changed by the hour. Power did not belong to the state anymore. It floated, claimed by whoever was loud enough, ruthless enough, or organized enough to seize it. In this chaos, the Thule Society did what it had always done best. It adapted. The members of Thule quickly understood that secret rooms and candlelit rituals were no longer enough. Germany was not looking for abstract myths. It was looking for action, for enemies with names, and for movements that promised immediate solutions. The society began to shift its focus from mystical contemplation to practical influence, embedding its ideology into real political structures. One of the most effective tools was propaganda. Thule members financed and supported nationalist newspapers in Munich, most notably the Münchener Beobachter. The paper was aggressively anti-Semitic, fiercely anti-communist, and obsessed with the idea that Germany's defeat had been engineered from within. It spoke in absolutes. There was no complexity, no ambiguity, only enemies and patriots. This language mattered. In a society exhausted by uncertainty, clarity felt like strength. The paper did not ask readers to think. It told them who to hate and why. Jews were blamed for inflation. Socialists were blamed for chaos. Liberals were blamed for weakness. Democracy itself was framed as a foreign infection imposed by the victors of the war. Behind these editorials were not anonymous fanatics, but educated men, former officers, aristocrats, journalists, who believed they were fighting for Germany's spiritual survival. To them, lies were not immoral if they served what they believed to be a higher truth. At the same time, Thule members became increasingly involved with paramilitary groups. Bavaria was flooded with Freikorps units, volunteer militias made up of former soldiers who refused to accept defeat. These men were trained, armed, and deeply traumatized. They were also politically volatile. Thule ideology fit them perfectly. The Freikorps did not see themselves as criminals or rebels. They saw themselves as guardians, the last line of defense against Bolshevism and national collapse. Thule members helped provide them with ideological justification, portraying violence as a necessary act of purification. Killing was reframed as duty. Fear was reframed as weakness. When the Bavarian Soviet Republic was declared in April 1919, Munich briefly became a communist experiment. Red flags flew over government buildings. Revolutionary tribunals were established. For nationalist circles, this was proof that their worst fears had come true. The counterattack was swift and brutal. Freikorps units, supported by conservative forces, crushed the Soviet Republic within weeks. Hundreds were executed, many without trial. Among the victims were individuals associated with left-wing politics, Jewish intellectuals, and suspected sympathizers, categories that often overlapped in the imagination of the far right. Several members of the Thule Society were arrested during the chaos, accused of conspiracy and counter-revolutionary plotting. A few were killed. Instead of weakening the movement, these deaths became symbols. Martyrdom reinforced the belief that they were engaged in a historic struggle, one that justified any means necessary. It was during this period that Thule's most dangerous contribution took shape: the normalization of political violence as moral necessity. Violence was no longer a last resort. It was a cleansing force. And this idea did not stay confined to secret societies. As Thule's influence spread, it intersected with a growing number of radical political groups seeking support, legitimacy, and funding. One of them was a small, obscure organization called the German Workers' Party. It held meetings in beer halls, attracted angry veterans, and spoke in crude but emotionally charged slogans. Thule members recognized its potential almost immediately. They did not care about the party's economic incoherence or its lack of structure. What mattered was tone. The German Workers' Party spoke the same language of betrayal, race, and rebirth. It did not offer policy. It offered belonging. Through intermediaries, Thule supporters provided financial assistance, access to printing presses, and venues for meetings. They connected activists to networks of sympathetic businessmen and former officers. The party grew, slowly but steadily, in the toxic soil of post-war Munich. This was not a conspiracy in the cinematic sense. There was no single master plan. What existed instead was ideological alignment, a shared worldview that made cooperation natural. The Thule Society did not need to control the party directly. It only needed to ensure that its ideas survived the transition from secret doctrine to public rhetoric. They did. By 1920, the German Workers' Party had transformed into the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Its program was explicitly anti-Semitic, nationalist, and authoritarian. Democracy was mocked. Violence was praised. History was rewritten as racial destiny. The myths of Thule had gone public. Importantly, this transition also marked the beginning of Thule's decline as an organization. As the Nazi movement gained momentum, secrecy became a liability. Mass politics required mass symbols, mass rallies, and charismatic leaders, not closed lodges and arcane rituals. The society began to dissolve, not because its ideas were rejected, but because they had been absorbed. What once required initiation now required only belief. The language of blood, soil, and destiny moved from pamphlets into speeches. Symbols once whispered about were painted on banners and armbands. The concept of a chosen race ceased to be mystical speculation and became political doctrine. And with that shift came something even more dangerous: legitimacy. Violence carried out by Freikorps units had been brutal, but it existed on the fringes of legality. Now, similar ideas were being expressed in party platforms and campaign slogans. Hatred was no longer the domain of secret orders. It was being debated in public halls, shouted in streets, and printed on ballots. The Thule Society faded quietly in the early 1920s. There was no dramatic end, no purge, no exposure that shocked the nation. Most Germans never heard of it, and never needed to. Its purpose had been fulfilled. The movement it helped nurture no longer needed occult language to justify itself. It had replaced mysticism with mass mobilization, and myth with spectacle. The emotional structure remained the same: a humiliated people, an invented enemy, and a promised rebirth through strength. What Thule demonstrated, and what the Nazis would perfect, was that ideology does not need to be true to be effective. It needs only to feel inevitable. By the time Adolf Hitler emerged as the central figure of the Nazi movement, the ground had already been prepared. The fear of Bolshevism, the obsession with race, the belief that Germany's suffering was proof of its chosenness rather than its mistakes. These ideas did not originate with him. They were waiting. And once a society accepts the idea that violence is destiny, that history demands blood, and that enemies are born rather than made, the transition from street fights to state terror becomes frighteningly short. The Thule Society never ruled Germany, but Germany would soon rule by the logic it helped create. By the early 1920s, something subtle but decisive had happened inside Germany's radical right. The language had changed. The tone had hardened. What had once been whispered among initiates in private rooms was now shouted from public platforms. The myth no longer needed guardians. It had found a voice. The disappearance of the Thule Society did not signal the failure of its worldview. It signaled its success. Germany had entered an era of mass politics, and mass politics demanded simplification. Occult symbolism, layered mythology, and secret initiation rituals were powerful tools for small, tightly bound circles, but they were inefficient for a movement that sought millions of followers. The rising leadership of the National Socialist German Workers' Party understood this instinctively. They did not abandon myth. They translated it. What Thule had wrapped in ancient runes, the Nazis repackaged as destiny. What had once been spoken of as racial memory became racial science. What had been framed as spiritual war became political necessity. This shift was not accidental. It was strategic. Germany in the early Weimar years was exhausted by abstraction. The public had no patience for metaphysical speculation or esoteric hierarchies. People wanted clarity. They wanted leaders who spoke plainly, enemies they could see, and explanations that felt immediate and complete. The Nazis offered exactly that, simple answers to unbearable complexity. Yet, beneath the surface, the old structure remained intact. Blood still mattered. Soil still mattered. History was still framed as a cosmic struggle. It was simply no longer called occultism. One of the clearest expressions of this transformation was the deliberate rejection of secret societies in favor of total visibility. Adolf Hitler, who rose to prominence after joining the German Workers' Party in 1919, had little patience for closed lodges and aristocratic mysticism. He did not deny the power of myth, but he despised exclusivity. Power, he believed, had to be seen. Hitler openly mocked astrologers, mystics, and occultists in private conversations, dismissing them as parasites and charlatans. Yet, this contempt was selective. He rejected their methods, not their conclusions. He believed deeply in destiny. He spoke constantly of providence. He framed his survival during the First World War as proof that history itself had spared him for a purpose. The difference was scale. Where Thule believed in awakening a select few, Hitler believed in mobilizing the masses. And to mobilize the masses, myth had to become simple, repeatable, and emotionally irresistible. This is where ideology hardened into dogma. Race was no longer presented as a spiritual inheritance, but as a biological fact. Anti-Semitism was no longer metaphysical. It was reframed as self-defense. Violence was no longer purification. It became policy. The language lost its poetry. It gained efficiency. By the mid-1920s, Nazi propaganda no longer needed explicit references to Thule, Hyperborea, or ancient northern continents. Those ideas survived implicitly, embedded in slogans such as blood and soil, and images like the eternal Jew. The audience did not need to know where the myth came from. It only needed to feel that it was true. This was the moment when ideas stopped being fringe and began to organize reality. Schools repeated them. Newspapers normalized them. Marches ritualized them. What had once required belief now demanded obedience. At the same time, the Nazi leadership grasped something the Thule Society never fully understood. Modern power flows through institutions. Myth alone could inspire, but it could not govern. To survive, ideology had to infiltrate education, law, youth movements, labor structures, and cultural life. Mysticism could awaken emotion. Bureaucracy could enforce behavior, and enforcement required structure. This evolution became unmistakable after the failed beer hall putsch in November 1923. The attempted coup in Munich collapsed quickly, and Hitler was arrested. On the surface, it appeared to be the end of the movement. In reality, it marked its transformation. Prison did not radicalize Hitler. It disciplined him. During his imprisonment at Landsberg, he dictated Mein Kampf, a text that stripped away much of the remaining esoteric language and replaced it with a rigid ideological framework. Destiny remained, but it was now bound to race and nation rather than mystery. Enemies were defined not as cosmic forces, but as biological threats. Violence was framed as tragic, unavoidable, and therefore justified. This shift was crucial. It made the ideology transferable. A myth that requires initiation dies with its initiates. A doctrine that claims to be scientific can be taught to children. By the late 1920s, the Nazi movement no longer relied on secret patrons or shadowy benefactors. It had built its own infrastructure: party offices, youth organizations, women's leagues, paramilitary wings, and propaganda networks. Each reinforced the same worldview from a different angle, saturating everyday life with ideological cues. The myth had become a system. Former members of the Thule milieu blended seamlessly into the structure. Some worked in publishing, others in education, cultural institutions, or propaganda offices. Their influence was no longer traceable to a single organization, which made it far more dangerous, because now it was everywhere. When the Nazis finally seized power in 1933, there was no need to resurrect secret societies. The state itself became the cult. Rituals moved from lodges to stadiums. Symbols were displayed not on private banners, but on public buildings, classrooms, uniforms, and coins. Loyalty was no longer sworn in whispers. It was demanded openly. What Thule had imagined as a hidden order ruling behind the scenes, the Nazis realized in plain sight. And once ideology occupies the state, belief becomes optional. Only compliance matters. This transformation also explains a seeming paradox: why the Nazi regime would later persecute independent occultists, astrologers, and mystics. After Rudolf Hess's flight to Scotland in 1941, Hitler ordered a sweeping crackdown on astrologers and esoteric groups. To outside observers, this appeared contradictory. Had Nazism not grown from occult roots? In reality, the logic was consistent. The regime no longer tolerated competing myths. Only one narrative was permitted, only one destiny, only one interpreter of history. Independent mysticism represented uncertainty, and uncertainty threatened control. The myth had served its purpose. Now it endangered uniformity. This is how ideological systems mature. They consume their origins. The Thule Society believed it was awakening Germany to a forgotten truth. It imagined itself as a guardian of ancient wisdom. What it actually did was help create an environment in which myth replaced responsibility, and violence could be framed as historical necessity. By the time Germany crossed the threshold into totalitarian rule, no one needed to mention Thule by name. The logic it helped normalize, that history outweighs morality, that hierarchy is natural, that empathy is weakness, had already been absorbed. The occult did not cause Nazism, but it helped prepare the mind. And once a society accepts that destiny matters more than choice, the transition from belief to atrocity becomes dangerously short. By the time the Nazi movement consolidated power in 1933, the transformation was complete. What had once existed as scattered beliefs, emotional reflexes, and half-articulated myths had been fused into a governing logic. The worldview that groups like the Thule Society had helped nurture no longer floated at the edges of political life. It now shaped law, culture, and the definition of reality itself. The state did not need to convince. It only needed to organize. This is the moment where ideology stops behaving like belief and begins functioning as infrastructure. The Nazi seizure of power did not immediately unleash mass murder. Instead, it initiated a process of normalization. Each step appeared incremental, procedural, and justified by necessity. This gradualism was not a failure of imagination. It was a deliberate strategy rooted in a mythic understanding of history, the belief that destruction must unfold as destiny, not impulse. The first priority was purification of institutions. Civil servants were screened, judges were aligned, teachers were replaced. Cultural organizations were absorbed. The regime understood that violence carried out without legitimacy provokes resistance, but violence embedded in law dissolves responsibility. When exclusion is legalized, participation becomes passive. This logic reflected a core assumption inherited from earlier ideological circles, that society is not a collection of individuals, but an organism. And organisms, the argument went, must eliminate threats to survive. Once this metaphor was accepted, everything else followed naturally. Jews were not persecuted as individuals, but classified as a category. Roma, the disabled political dissidents, and others deemed degenerate, were similarly reframed, not as citizens with rights, but as elements of decay. This language did not emerge suddenly in 1933. It had been rehearsed for years, long before the Nazis controlled the state. The difference now was authority. Law became the ritual. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 did not shock German society because they did not introduce a new worldview. They formalized one that had already been normalized. Citizenship was redefined not by participation or loyalty, but by ancestry. Marriage became a racial matter. Intimacy became political. Identity became biological. These were not mystical decrees. They were administrative, and that was precisely their power. The earlier mythic frameworks had taught people to think in absolutes, pure and impure, belonging and contamination, destiny and degeneration. The Nazi state translated those binaries into registries, documents, and procedures. Violence no longer required hatred. It required compliance. The regime's genius, and its danger, lay in its ability to make extraordinary cruelty feel routine. The transformation was reinforced through spectacle. Mass rallies, carefully choreographed, replaced private initiations. Flags, uniforms, and music performed the same psychological function once served by symbols and rituals in secret societies. The individual dissolved into the collective. Responsibility dissolved into movement. Belonging became intoxicating. At the same time, the regime cultivated fear, not chaotic fear, but disciplined fear. The Gestapo did not rely on omnipresence. It relied on uncertainty. No one knew who might be listening. No one knew what might be reported. Silence became a form of self-preservation. This environment did not require ideological zeal from everyone. It required acquiescence. The myth that history demanded sacrifice had matured into a political axiom, that morality was secondary to survival, and survival was defined by race. This is where the legacy of earlier ideological currents becomes unmistakable. The idea that violence is tragic but necessary, that it is imposed by history rather than chosen, allowed perpetrators to perceive themselves as instruments rather than agents. Orders were followed not because they were cruel, but because they were framed as unavoidable. Destiny does not require guilt. As the regime expanded its reach beyond Germany's borders after 1938, the same logic scaled effortlessly. Annexation was framed as reunification. Occupation was framed as protection. Invasion was framed as correction. Each action was justified not by conquest, but by historical entitlement. When war began in 1939, it did not disrupt this worldview. It fulfilled it. The invasion of Poland marked a critical escalation. Violence that had been contained within legal and social frameworks now extended outward. Entire populations were reclassified. Human beings became variables in administrative plans. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units operating behind the front lines, did not see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as executors of policy. Their reports were meticulous, numerical, sanitized. Death was recorded as data. This bureaucratic precision was not an aberration. It was the logical outcome of an ideology that had stripped human life of intrinsic value. The transition from mass shootings to industrialized extermination followed the same internal logic. When killing by hand proved psychologically taxing and inefficient, technology provided solutions. Gas chambers were not born of madness. They were born of optimization. The myth had reached its final form. At this stage, references to ancient ancestors or lost civilizations were unnecessary. The ideological work had already been done. What remained was implementation. It is crucial to understand that many participants in this system did not experience themselves as monsters. They experienced themselves as professionals. Clerks, engineers, doctors, lawyers, all performed their roles within a framework that framed mass murder as a regrettable but essential task. This is what separates ideological violence from spontaneous brutality. Spontaneous violence is chaotic. Ideological violence is orderly. The foundations laid in the years after 1918, the belief that Germany's suffering was evidence of chosenness, that enemies were internal and existential, that history demanded purification, made this order possible. The Thule Society did not design extermination camps. It did not issue killing orders, but it helped normalize a way of thinking in which such outcomes could be perceived as rational. By the early 1940s, the Nazi state no longer needed myth to motivate action. It had replaced myth with routine. Killing became procedural. Deportation became logistical. Annihilation became administrative. This is the most dangerous stage of ideological systems. When belief fades, but behavior continues. When the war turned against Germany, the logic did not collapse. It intensified. Defeat was interpreted not as evidence of failure, but as proof of betrayal and insufficient purity. The solution, once again, was not reflection, but escalation. The myth had become immune to reality. In the final years of the war, even as cities burned and infrastructure collapsed, the machinery of extermination continued to function. Resources were diverted. Trains were prioritized. Killing persisted even when it undermined military necessity. This is the point at which ideology reveals its true nature. Not a tool for achieving goals, but a structure that defines reality itself. The legacy of this transformation did not end in 1945. The defeat of Nazi Germany dismantled the state, but it did not erase the psychological mechanisms that had made it possible. The belief that history demands sacrifice, that suffering grants moral exemption, that complexity must be reduced to enemies. These ideas did not die in the ruins. They retreated. They waited. The Thule Society vanished early, quietly, without consequence. Its name faded into obscurity, but the logic it helped incubate survived far beyond it. Not as occultism, not as mysticism, but as a pattern. A pattern that reappears whenever societies experience humiliation, fear, and loss of meaning. A pattern that promises clarity in exchange for empathy. A pattern that frames violence as destiny rather than choice. Understanding this is not about assigning blame to secret societies or mystical beliefs. It is about recognizing how ideas migrate, adapt, and embed themselves in structures of power. The most dangerous ideologies are not those that announce themselves as evil. They are the ones that present themselves as necessary. The temptation, after confronting the enormity of what followed, is to isolate the Thule Society as an anomaly, a strange footnote in German history, a fringe group whose ideas spiraled out of control. This interpretation is comforting. It suggests that Nazism emerged from something exotic, abnormal, even uniquely German. It is also wrong. The Thule Society was not an exception. It was a symptom. What made it dangerous was not its occult language or its fixation on ancient myths, but the conditions in which it operated and the psychological needs it fulfilled. Those conditions are not unique to post-World War I Germany. They recur with unsettling regularity whenever societies experience defeat, humiliation, or a collapse of meaning. Thule did not invent hatred. It organized it. At its core, the worldview promoted by Thule offered three interlocking promises: explanation, belonging, and inevitability. These promises are not mystical. They are deeply human. First, explanation. Germany after 1918 was drowning in unanswered questions. Why had a powerful empire fallen so quickly? Why had sacrifice led to defeat rather than victory? Why did suffering seem random and meaningless? Liberal democracy offered complexity and responsibility, answers that required patience, nuance, and self-examination. Groups like Thule offered something else entirely: total explanation. Nothing had gone wrong by chance. Nothing had failed because of human error or miscalculation. History, they claimed, followed hidden laws. If Germany had fallen, it was because hostile forces had interfered with destiny. This removed uncertainty, and with it, guilt. Explanation without responsibility is intoxicating. Second, belonging. Defeat fractures identity. It leaves individuals stranded between a past that no longer exists and a future that feels inaccessible. Thule offered membership in something older, purer, and supposedly indestructible. You were not merely German. You were the heir to an ancient lineage. Your suffering was not meaningless. It was proof that you mattered. Belonging in this sense was not social. It was metaphysical. And metaphysical belonging does not tolerate outsiders. Third, inevitability. Perhaps the most dangerous promise of all was the idea that history itself demanded action. Violence was not framed as desire or revenge. It was framed as necessity. Once this premise is accepted, moral debate becomes irrelevant. Choice disappears. Responsibility dissolves. This triad, explanation, belonging, inevitability, appears again and again in movements far removed from Munich in 1918. It appears after military defeat, after economic collapse, after cultural disorientation. Whenever societies lose a coherent narrative about who they are and why they suffer, the demand for myth intensifies. The specific symbols change, the language adapts, but the structure remains. In Tsarist Russia's collapse, apocalyptic ideologies flourished. In post-Ottoman territories, mythic nationalism surged. In the wake of colonial humiliation, racial and civilizational myths re-emerged across continents. None of these movements required occultism to function. What they required was a story that transformed pain into purpose. This is why focusing solely on Thule's esoteric elements misses the point. The runes, the myths of Hyperborea, the obsession with ancient homelands, these were aesthetic choices. The underlying mechanism was psychological. The Thule Society did not radicalize Germany by itself. It aligned with existing fears and gave them narrative shape. It reduced complexity into binary oppositions, pure and impure, loyal and traitorous, destined and degenerate. Binary thinking is efficient. It is also lethal. Once a society accepts that the world is divided into irreconcilable forces, compromise becomes betrayal. Pluralism becomes decay. Violence becomes corrective rather than destructive. This logic does not require belief in ancient gods. It requires belief in historical mission. That belief proved transferable. When the Nazis abandoned occult language, they did not abandon the framework Thule had helped normalize. They replaced myth with pseudoscience, ritual with bureaucracy, and initiation with indoctrination. But the emotional architecture remained intact. The lesson here is uncomfortable. Extremist systems rarely begin with commands to kill. They begin with explanations that feel reasonable to people in pain. They begin by redefining failure as victimhood as chosenness, chosenness as entitlement. From there, exclusion follows naturally. This is why the early years matter so much. The years before power is seized. The years when ideas circulate without consequences. The years when violence is still rhetorical. By the time those ideas harden into law, resistance becomes dangerous and often futile. The Thule Society operated during that formative stage. It did not control outcomes, but it helped shape the conceptual boundaries of what could later be imagined, justified, and enacted. It helped move violence from the realm of taboo into the realm of duty. Understanding this does not mean equating all nationalist or spiritual movements with Nazism. It means recognizing patterns. Patterns of myth replacing analysis. Patterns of destiny replacing accountability. Patterns of belonging replacing empathy. These patterns are not relics of the past. They reappear whenever societies experience humiliation without reflection, fear without leadership, and loss without meaning. They reappear when complexity is perceived as weakness and certainty as strength. The danger is not in symbolism. It is in absolutism. The most destructive ideologies are not those that promise chaos. They are the ones that promise order, an order that requires sacrifice from others. The Thule Society's true legacy is not occultism. It is demonstration. Demonstration of how quickly ideas can migrate from the margins to the center. Demonstration of how myths can be laundered into policy. Demonstration of how ordinary people can be prepared to accept extraordinary cruelty, not through hatred alone, but through explanation. By the time violence becomes visible, the intellectual groundwork has already been laid, and by then, it is usually too late. This is not a story about a secret society that went too far. It is a story about how societies search for meaning after collapse, and what happens when that search is answered with myth instead of responsibility. The Thule Society never ruled Germany. It never commanded armies, signed laws, or issued death sentences. Its meetings were small, its membership limited, its name forgotten by most. And yet, its influence did not disappear. It dissolved. This is how dangerous ideas survive. They do not cling to symbols forever. They shed their rituals when those rituals become inefficient. They abandon mystery when mystery no longer persuades. What remains is structure. The structure Thule helped normalize was not occultism, but a way of seeing the world, one in which suffering was proof of chosenness, hierarchy was natural, and violence could be reframed as obligation rather than choice. Once that structure took hold, it no longer needed ancient myths to justify itself. It could call itself science. It could call itself security. It could call itself necessity. The transition was seamless. By the time Germany confronted the consequences of this worldview, the logic behind it felt ordinary, administrative, even boring. Paperwork replaced prophecy. Trains replaced rituals. Schedules replaced spells. The myth had completed its final transformation, from belief into routine. This is the point at which history becomes most dangerous, not when people are passionate, but when they are certain. Certainty erases doubt. Doubt enables empathy. Without empathy, violence no longer requires hatred. It requires only procedure. When people stop asking whether something is right and begin asking whether it is required, morality collapses quietly. The Thule Society believed it was revealing hidden truths about the past. What it actually demonstrated was something far more enduring: how easily meaning can be manufactured when societies are wounded, and how quickly that meaning can harden into inevitability. The most important lesson is not that occult ideas can be dangerous. It is that explanations without responsibility are irresistible. Whenever defeat is reframed as betrayal, whenever complexity is reduced to enemies, whenever destiny is invoked to excuse cruelty, the pattern reappears. The names change. The symbols change. The language modernizes. The structure remains. Evil does not begin with orders. It begins with stories that feel comforting, stories that promise clarity instead of understanding, belonging instead of empathy, inevitability instead of choice. The Thule Society vanished without consequence. But the ideas it helped legitimize did not vanish at all. They learned how to sound reasonable. They learned how to wear uniforms. They learned how to file reports. And that is why this story does not end in 1945. Because the most dangerous myths are not the ones that announce themselves as myths. They are the ones that insist they are simply how the world works.